If you find yourself in the Netherlands or Belgium at the end of November, you may suddenly discover that you have wandered into a Sinterklaas parade. The air is filled with the scent of spiced biscuits, children scan the horizon with anticipation, and eventually an old man appears, carrying a staff, wearing a long white beard and a bishop's mitre. In the Netherlands and Belgium, this figure is immediately recognized as Sinterklaas, but beyond these regions he often causes confusion. In many other parts of the world, people know only Santa Claus, and this figure is therefore seen not as familiar, but as a strange and unfamiliar character. The figure walking beside him makes the scene even more striking. This companion is unique to the Low Countries and has, for many years, been the subject of debate and controversy. To many, Piet is simply the loyal helper of Sinterklaas, an inseparable part of the celebration as they have known it since childhood. Yet over the centuries, this helper has undergone significant changes, both in appearance and in meaning. To understand where this figure comes from, we must look far further back in time than the Sinterklaas celebration itself. Much further back, in fact, to a period when Christianity had not yet established itself in Northern Europe. Long before Saint Nicholas was venerated, Germanic peoples worshipped a powerful chief god, Wodan, better known in Scandinavia as Odin. This belief system emerged well before the beginning of the Common Era and endured into the early Middle Ages, roughly between 100 BCE and 800 CE. Across large parts of what are now the Netherlands, Germany, and Scandinavia, Wodan was seen as an all-seeing wanderer, a god of wisdom and knowledge, but also of war, death, and magic. He was not a gentle or benevolent figure, but a stern presence who watched over the world of humans. According to ancient stories, Wodan never remained in one place for long. By day, he sent his two ravens, Hugin and Munin, out into the world. They flew over villages and settlements, listening to conversations and carefully observing human behavior. At the end of the day, they returned to report everything they had seen and heard. In folk tales, it was said that these ravens found their way into homes through openings such as smoke holes and chimneys. The idea that a higher power observes human behavior through the chimney is therefore far older than the Sinterklaas tradition itself. When night fell, Wodan began his own journey. Cloaked in a dark mantle and wearing a wide-brimmed hat that partially obscured his face, he rode through the night sky on his remarkable horse, Sleipnir. With 8 legs, the horse could travel effortlessly through the air. When people heard howling winds at night or saw storms gathering, they believed Wodan and his spectral entourage were riding across the sky. This phenomenon later became known as the Wild Hunt, a ghostly procession that inspired both awe and fear. Families, and especially children, sought to appease Wodan. Food was sometimes left out for Sleipnir, in the hope that the god would show mercy or offer protection. Those who behaved well could expect favor, those who did not risked punishment or misfortune. The image of a wandering figure who travels by night, assisted by watchers who see and hear everything, became deeply embedded in the collective memory of these societies. When Christianity later spread across Northern Europe and the Sinterklaas celebration took shape, these ancient stories did not simply disappear. Instead, they faded, blended, and transformed. Yet beneath the festive surface, traces of a much older narrative remain, a story that begins with a god riding through the night sky, accompanied by helpers who listen, remember, and report. Long after the age of the Germanic gods began to fade, a real historical figure entered the stage, Nicholas of Myra. He was born around the year 270 CE in the city of Patara, in what is now modern-day Turkey, and later became bishop of the nearby city of Myra. Unlike Wodan, Nicholas was not a god or a myth, but a human being whose reputation grew through stories of compassion, secrecy, and moral justice. Nicholas became known for helping those in need without seeking recognition. One of the most enduring stories tells of a poor father who could not afford dowries for his 3 daughters and feared they would be sold into slavery. Under the cover of night, Nicholas secretly threw bags of gold through the man's window, which fell into the daughters' shoes, saving the family from ruin. Over time, this act transformed Nicholas into a protector of children and the vulnerable, and it cemented the idea of a benevolent figure who gives gifts unseen, while others sleep. As his legend spread, Nicholas also became the patron saint of sailors and merchants. This was largely due to a maritime miracle attributed to him. According to tradition, Nicholas calmed a violent storm at sea, saving a ship and its crew from certain destruction. Another story speaks of a ship carrying grain or flour that miraculously arrived at its destination fully loaded, even after some of its cargo had been taken to relieve famine elsewhere. Because of these stories, sailors came to see Nicholas as their heavenly protector, a figure who guarded them on dangerous voyages. It was through these sailors that something remarkable happened. As Christianity spread northward into regions where belief in Wodan still lingered, the stories of Nicholas did not replace the old myths overnight. Instead, they merged. Northern European seafarers, already familiar with a god who traveled the skies, judged behavior, and was associated with storms and wind, began to overlay Nicholas onto older traditions. A protector of sailors fit seamlessly into a worldview already shaped by Wodan. At this point in history, Nicholas was not yet Saint Nicholas in the modern sense. He had no white horse, no red costume, no servants, and certainly no festive celebration. He was a bishop, remembered through stories passed from mouth to mouth. But as these stories traveled across cultures, they absorbed familiar elements. The traveling god became a traveling saint. The night rides through the sky became journeys across rooftops. The judgment of human behavior remained, but it softened, reshaped into moral lessons for children. In the Low Countries, this blending took on a particularly enduring form. Because Nicholas was the patron saint of sailors, he continued to arrive by ship, even long after ships no longer defined everyday life. Because Wodan rode through the sky on his horse, Nicholas too gained a horse, now said to walk across rooftops instead of clouds. These elements were not invented all at once, but layered slowly, generation after generation, until they felt inseparable. The companions of this figure evolved as well. Where Wodan had ravens who listened and reported, early Christian folklore introduced darker figures. In medieval Europe, saints were often depicted alongside demons they had defeated, bound, or forced into submission. These figures symbolized chaos brought under control by Christian morality. Early versions of Nicholas's companion were sometimes described not as a helper, but as a restrained demon or wild spirit, a dangerous force placed under the authority of the saint. This companion functioned as a moral counterweight. While Saint Nicholas embodied mercy, generosity, and reward, the dark figure represented punishment, fear, and consequence. Together they formed a complete moral system. Good behavior was rewarded, while misbehavior was confronted. In this sense, the companion was not merely a servant, but an externalized judgment, much like Wodan's ravens had once been. This tradition survives most clearly in Austria, where Saint Nicholas is still celebrated with a demon at his side. This figure is known as Krampus, a horned, bestial creature rooted in pre-Christian Alpine folklore. To this day, Krampusnacht is celebrated annually, during which masked participants dressed as demons roam the streets, reenacting the ancient tension between order and chaos. Unlike later, softened interpretations, Krampus remains explicitly monstrous, preserving one of the oldest layers of the tradition. In Western Europe, however, this demonized presence gradually lost its terrifying features. As the Church sought to make the celebration more suitable for children, the monstrous companion was reshaped into a human figure. In Germany, this resulted in Knecht Ruprecht, originally depicted as a dark, ragged man, sometimes with horns or animalistic traits, who questioned children about their behavior. Over time, his demonic aspects faded, leaving behind a stern but human helper. In France, a similar transformation produced Père Fouettard, a darker alter ego to Saint Nicholas, associated with punishment and discipline. His origins lie in medieval morality tales, yet as with Ruprecht, his role softened across generations. He shifted from executioner and monster to symbolic disciplinarian, and eventually to a recognizable companion rather than a threat. Across Europe, these figures followed the same trajectory. What began as demons, spirits, or embodiments of fear slowly transformed into servants, helpers, and symbolic figures. The terror was reduced, the lesson remained. In the Low Countries, this process would continue until the companion became fully integrated into the Sinterklaas tradition, no longer a demon to be feared, but a connect who listened, remembered, and reported, echoing, in a distant and altered form, the ravens of Wodan. After the Reformation reached the Low Countries in the 16th century, the public celebration of Saint Nicholas changed dramatically. As Protestantism became dominant, particularly in the Dutch Republic, Catholic practices were increasingly suppressed. Saints were rejected as objects of veneration, churches were stripped of statues, and feast days associated with Catholic saints were officially discouraged. Saint Nicholas, as a Catholic bishop and miracle-working saint, no longer had a place in public religious life. Yet the tradition did not disappear. Instead, it retreated into the private sphere. Families continued to mark the early days of December quietly at home, reframing Saint Nicholas not as a holy intercessor, but as a moral and cultural figure. In this new context, the religious saint slowly transformed into a folkloric character. Gift-giving survived, but devotion did not. This shift is crucial. Sinterklaas endured precisely because he became less religious and more domestic. In some Protestant households, overt Catholic imagery was avoided altogether. Historical sources and folkloric studies suggest that small symbolic figures were sometimes used instead of saintly statues. These figures were not officially Saint Nicholas, but abstract stand-ins, small, bearded, gnome-like or man-shaped objects that allowed families to preserve the tradition without violating Protestant norms. While not universally documented in the same form everywhere, this practice fits within a broader, well-established pattern of symbolic substitution during periods of religious restriction. The saint was remembered, but carefully disguised. By the 18th century, Sinterklaas had become a largely secular tradition in the Netherlands, tolerated rather than endorsed. It was still celebrated, but inconsistently, and often criticized by authorities and moral reformers as unruly or old-fashioned. At the same time, the figure accompanying Saint Nicholas had become increasingly frightening. Influenced by older demon traditions such as Krampus, Knecht Ruprecht, the helper was often depicted as a threatening presence, used to scare children into obedience. This fear-based role began to clash with changing ideas about childhood and education. The turning point came in the 19th century. In 1850, Dutch schoolteacher and writer Jan Schenkman published the illustrated children's book Sint Nicolaas en zijn Knecht. This work fundamentally reshaped the Sinterklaas tradition. Schenkman presented Saint Nicholas as a dignified, benevolent figure who arrived from Spain by steamship, rode a white horse across rooftops, and was assisted by a single, clearly defined helper. This helper was no longer a demon, nor a wild figure of punishment, but a human servant. Schenkman portrayed this servant as a Moorish page, dressed in exotic clothing inspired by 19th-century European ideas about the Islamic world and Spain's Moorish past. However, this choice was not merely aesthetic. In the cultural context of the mid-19th century, such figures were closely associated with slavery and colonial domination. The image of a dark-skinned servant attending a white master reflected a deeply ingrained social hierarchy, one that was familiar to Dutch audiences during and shortly after the era of transatlantic slavery. Although Schenkman never explicitly labeled the helper as a slave, the visual language of his illustrations leaves little ambiguity. The Knecht is presented as obedient, subordinate, and dependent, existing solely in service of Saint Nicholas. This aligns with contemporary stereotypes of enslaved or formerly enslaved people, who were commonly depicted as loyal attendants lacking autonomy. In this sense, the helper was no longer a demon brought under control, but a human figure defined by enforced servitude. Importantly, this shift did not remove fear from the tradition entirely, but redirected it. Punishment became symbolic rather than physical, and authority was expressed through hierarchy rather than terror. The helper's role moved toward assistance, humor, and physical labor, making the celebration more palatable for children while preserving a clear power imbalance between Saint Nicholas and his companion. By the early 20th century, Sinterklaas had become firmly established as a national children's celebration in the Netherlands. By 1925, the image of Saint Nicholas as a dignified white bishop accompanied by one or more Zwarte Pieten was widely normalized through schools, illustrated books, shop displays, and the emerging mass media. Zwarte Piet was almost always portrayed with jet black skin, exaggerated red lips, a curly wig, golden earrings, and colorful Renaissance-style clothing. These features were not accidental embellishments but part of a visual language that closely mirrored colonial caricatures common throughout Europe at the time. From the 1930s through the 1950s, these portrayals hardened into convention. In radio programs, school performances, and later television, Zwarte Piet was often given a thick Surinamese or Afro-Caribbean accent, broken Dutch, and childlike mannerisms. He was routinely depicted as naive, clumsy, loud, and unintelligent, in contrast to the calm, wise, and authoritative Saint Nicholas. This characterization was widely accepted and rarely questioned. The Netherlands still ruled Suriname and the Antilles, and racial hierarchies inherited from colonialism were largely invisible to the dominant white population. What would later be recognized as racist imagery was, at the time, socially tolerated and institutionally reproduced. The first documented objections to Zwarte Piet appeared earlier than many assume. As early as the 1930s and 1940s, individual writers and educators occasionally criticized the figure as inappropriate or outdated, though these voices remained marginal. More visible resistance emerged in the 1960s, particularly after the abolition of slavery in the Dutch colonies was increasingly discussed in public discourse and Suriname moved toward independence. In 1968, the Surinamese Dutch writer and activist Anton de Kom posthumously gained renewed attention, and broader conversations about racism slowly began to surface. Nevertheless, throughout the 1970s and 1980s, the dominant portrayal of Zwarte Piet remained unchanged. Television programs such as the nationally broadcast Sinterklaas journal reinforced the image of Piet as silly, subordinate, and comical. The exaggerated accent, bright red lips, and clownish behavior were framed as harmless fun, even as children of color increasingly reported feeling mocked or excluded. These experiences were rarely acknowledged in mainstream debate. By the 1990s, criticism became more organized. Educators, artists, and activists, particularly from Surinamese and Antillean communities, began publicly naming Zwarte Piet as a racist caricature rooted in slavery and colonialism. In 1998, a formal complaint was submitted to the United Nations Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, marking a significant escalation. While the complaint did not immediately change policy, it shifted the debate from cultural preference to human rights. The 2000s marked a period of growing polarization. Defenders of the tradition increasingly framed Zwarte Piet as just a children's character, while critics emphasized the historical continuity between blackface imagery and colonial oppression. Around this time, some local schools and municipalities quietly began experimenting with alternatives, including soot-smudged faces, though these changes were rarely advertised. A decisive rupture occurred in the 2010s. In 2011, artist Quincy Gario was arrested during a peaceful protest wearing a shirt that read, "Zwarte Piet is racism." This moment catalyzed a new generation of activists. In 2014, the movement Kick Out Zwarte Piet, KOZP, was founded, organizing protests at parades across the country. These demonstrations were met with both growing support and intense hostility, revealing deep societal divisions. Under mounting pressure, major institutions began to shift. From 2015 onward, national broadcasters gradually altered their portrayals. The Sinterklaas journal introduced Zwarte Pieten, whose faces bore soot marks rather than full blackface. By the late 2010s, exaggerated accents, red lips, and earrings largely disappeared from mainstream media depictions. Many municipalities officially abandoned traditional Zwarte Piet altogether. The transition was uneven and contested. While urban areas and national media moved relatively quickly, some rural regions and private celebrations retained older forms. Yet by the early 2020s, the cultural tide had clearly turned. Surveys showed that a majority of Dutch citizens now supported non-blackface alternatives, particularly when framed as child-friendly and inclusive rather than political. By 2025, Sinterklaas celebrations in the Netherlands and Belgium look markedly different from those of a century earlier. Zwarte Piet, as he existed in 1925, has largely vanished from public space. In his place stands a variety of helpers with soot-smudged faces, colorful appearances, or no face paint at all. The figure is no longer portrayed as stupid, subordinate, or racially marked, but as competent, equal, and playful. From ravens to demons, from shadowy spirits to mythical figures, from enslaved servants to cheerful companions, the figure we know as Zwarte Piet has taken many forms across the centuries. Under different names and appearances, he has always reflected the world that created him. These figures did not simply entertain, they carried beliefs, fears, hierarchies, and values from one generation to the next. Zwarte Piet, in all his transformations, has remained part of our collective memory not because he was fixed, but because he changed. To understand him is not to erase the past, but to recognize it, and to learn from where these stories began.